Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. It was a quiet afternoon, one of those days when the sun stretches lazily across the sky, spilling golden light through every open space. I had been cleaning the house, airing out the rooms like I often did, and decided to let some fresh air into the kitchen. My old house has windows that don't slide easily. They stick, squeak, and sometimes fight back like they're guarding the outdoors. I pushed one open, leaned out just a bit to knock some dust from the sill, and before I knew it, my sweater caught on the latch. I tugged, twisted, and realized with a sick little laugh that I had managed to wedge myself halfway out. There I was, arms braced awkwardly on the frame, my torso bent forward into the open air, the rest of me pinned uncomfortably inside. It might sound funny now, but at that moment, I felt embarrassed and a little helpless. The world outside was so still, the leaves trembling gently in the breeze, a dog barking a few houses down, a lawnmower humming faintly in the distance, while I was stuck in the most ridiculous way possible. I tried to wriggle free, but the more I pulled, the tighter the fabric seemed to cling. That's when I heard footsteps crunching along the walkway that separated my house from the one next door. My neighbor, Daniel, appeared around the hedge. He's a kind man in his late 50s, tall with graying hair, the sort of neighbor who always waves when he sees you and carries an air of calm wherever he goes. "Everything all right over there?" he called, his voice carrying a note of concern, though I could see the hint of a smile tugging at his mouth when he realized my predicament. I laughed nervously, cheeks warming. "Not exactly. I seem to have gotten myself, well, stuck." Daniel came closer, setting down the small toolbox he had been carrying. He tilted his head, studying the scene like he was puzzling out how to help without making me feel more embarrassed than I already did. "Looks like that window decided to win today," he said gently. I tried to shrug, though it was more of a lopsided movement given my position. "It's not my finest moment, I'll admit." He approached slowly, respectful of my space. "Mind if I give you a hand?" I nodded, relieved. There was something reassuring in his steady presence. As he stepped up to the window, I could see the weathered lines on his face, the kind that come from years of smiling and working outdoors. He didn't laugh at me, not really. Instead, his voice carried the patience of someone who had seen life's odd little accidents before. "Okay," he said softly, almost as though he was narrating his thoughts for me. "If we lift the fabric here and ease the latch open a bit more, you should be able to slide back inside without too much trouble." His hands worked carefully, never brushing against me unless absolutely necessary, and when they did, it was with the gentleness of someone who understood how easily embarrassment could sting. He spoke to me the whole time, keeping me calm, reminding me to take a breath. I hadn't realized how tense I was until his calmness began to settle into me like warm sunlight. Finally, with a small tug and a soft tearing sound as my sweater gave way, I stumbled back inside. I caught myself against the counter, hair falling around my face, and let out a breathless laugh. Daniel stood on the other side of the window, smiling kindly. "Well, you're free," he said. "And none the worse for wear, except maybe that sweater." I smoothed the fabric self-consciously, then looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come by." His smile deepened, though it wasn't just amusement, it was understanding. "That's what neighbors are for. Besides, everyone gets stuck sometimes. In windows, or in life." The way he said it lingered with me. It wasn't just a joke, it carried a weight, a quiet wisdom. I found myself looking at him differently, noticing the steady way he held himself, the patience in his eyes. For a moment, I realized how rarely anyone really pauses to help us when we're caught in life's little traps, both silly and serious. I invited him inside for a glass of water as thanks, and he accepted, wiping his hands on a cloth before stepping into my kitchen. The space suddenly felt warmer, more alive with his presence. We talked about simple things at first, the stubbornness of old windows, the unpredictability of home repairs, but beneath it, there was something unspoken. A sense of connection that surprised me. As we sat at the small kitchen table, the sunlight streaming across the worn wood, I noticed the quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was steady, almost comforting, as though both of us were aware of something changing, even if we couldn't name it yet. I caught myself smiling more than usual, and he seemed to notice. When our eyes met, I felt a flicker of something: respect, kindness, and the possibility of friendship that could mean more than just casual waves across the yard. That afternoon stayed with me, not just because I had been foolishly caught in a window, but because it reminded me of how unexpected moments can bring people closer together. Sometimes it takes being stuck to see who shows up to help, and sometimes that help feels like more than just a favor. It feels like a small turning point. When Daniel eventually stood to leave, he did so with a calm nod, picking up his toolbox again. "Anytime you need a hand, just knock," he said. I walked him to the door, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and curiosity, like a story had just begun without me realizing it. Watching him walk back to his house, the evening light catching his shoulders, I couldn't help but think that maybe this moment, silly as it started, would be one I'd remember for far longer than I expected, and I was right. After that afternoon with the window, the days settled back into their usual rhythm, but something in me had shifted. I found myself glancing toward Daniel's house more often, noticing the way the light hit his porch in the early morning or the way he tended to his garden with a quiet, careful precision. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a gentle pull, a recognition of someone who had stepped in when I needed help, not because he had to, but because he chose to. A few days later, I was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes that had grown wild over the summer. My hands were scratched from the thorns, and I realized I needed a ladder to reach the higher branches. Just as I was debating whether to climb up with the precarious balance of my aching arms, I heard the familiar crunch of footsteps on the gravel ladder. "Issues?" Daniel's voice floated over, calm and knowing. I turned and laughed, brushing my hands on my apron. "Exactly. I can't seem to conquer these roses without falling into the flowerbed." He set down a small folding ladder he had clearly carried with him. "Let me help. You're supposed to enjoy your garden, not get trapped by it." I felt a warmth that went beyond simple gratitude as he positioned the ladder and held it steady while I climbed. The trust in that simple act, the physical support, the presence beside me, felt quietly significant. I wasn't used to asking for help, and even less used to accepting it so naturally. As I worked, he stayed close, chatting about ordinary things: the weather, a book he had just finished, a funny story about his dog. His voice was easy to listen to, soothing yet engaging, and I realized I was smiling more freely than I had in weeks. There was a rhythm to the way we moved around each other, a sense of cooperation that felt effortless. At one point, I lost my footing slightly, and Daniel's hand shot out to steady me. The touch was brief but grounding, and I felt a flutter of awareness I couldn't ignore. I laughed nervously, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "I think I'm more likely to get stuck in my garden than in my house these days." He chuckled, a deep, steady sound. "Well, at least I'll always be around when that happens." We continued working together, arranging the roses, trimming the dead branches, and I noticed the way he watched, careful not to hover but present enough to make me feel safe. I thought about how rare it was to meet someone who could be both attentive and respectful, someone whose kindness didn't feel forced. There was no rush, no expectation, just a shared space, two people quietly enjoying a simple afternoon. After we finished, I leaned against the garden gate, brushing sweat from my forehead. Daniel stood beside me, leaning on the ladder, and for a moment, we just looked at the rows of roses, their colors vibrant in the late afternoon light. It felt like a pause in the world, a moment outside the ordinary, where everything else could wait. "You know," he said softly, "I never realized how much work goes into keeping a garden like this alive." I laughed, shaking my head. "It's more than I expected myself. But somehow, it feels worth it." There was a quiet understanding between us then, the kind that doesn't need words. He didn't linger unnecessarily, but when he left, I felt a sense of longing I hadn't expected. It wasn't just for his company, it was for the feeling of being seen, of having someone care without question. That evening, I sat by the window, the one that had caused all the trouble, and watched the sky darken into deep shades of blue and orange. I thought about Daniel and the subtle way he had entered my life, not with grand gestures, but with steady, gentle presence. I realized that the afternoon had been more than just about roses. It had been a lesson in trust, in opening oneself to connection, even when it comes unexpectedly. As night settled, I found myself reflecting on how small moments, the catch of a sweater, the crunch of footsteps on gravel, could ripple into something far more meaningful than I could have imagined. And I knew, even then, that this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and I found ourselves crossing paths more often, though never in a way that felt forced. There was a rhythm to it, a naturalness that made each encounter feel like a continuation of the last rather than a coincidence. I started noticing the small gestures, how he would pause to ask if I needed help carrying groceries, or how he would check on the mailbox when the weather was particularly stormy. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deeply reassuring, a quiet thread weaving our days together. One late afternoon, I was organizing my living room, moving old boxes and sorting through stacks of forgotten books, when I realized I had reached the point of needing an extra pair of hands. Before I could even step outside to call him, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Daniel standing there, a warm smile on his face, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need a break," he said simply, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The familiarity didn't feel intrusive, it felt comforting, like someone who understood your space could still inhabit it respectfully. We carried boxes together, sharing small talk and laughter. He would occasionally glance at the piles of old papers and laugh softly. "You're hiding treasures in here," he said, and I realized he was right. There were letters I had forgotten, photographs from decades ago, little notes tucked in books. Each one brought a rush of memory, some sweet, some bittersweet, and I found myself sharing stories I hadn't told anyone in years. As we worked, I noticed the subtle ease between us. There was no tension, no pressure, just the simple act of 2 people collaborating and listening. He would pause when I needed a moment, never rushing me, yet his presence felt steady, a kind of quiet anchor. At one point, I picked up an old photo album and found a picture of myself in my 30s, smiling with people I no longer saw. I hesitated, then showed it to him. "I used to think I had everything figured out," I said softly, almost to myself. Daniel looked at it with care, nodding slowly. "It's funny, isn't it? How much life can change in a few years, and yet some parts, moments, memories, they stay with us forever." His words resonated. I realized that having someone to share these fragments of life with, someone who could see me beyond the surface, was rare and precious. And in that moment, a subtle shift happened. What had started as neighborly concern was becoming something more meaningful, though neither of us spoke it aloud. As evening approached, we paused to look out the window at the sun dipping behind the horizon, casting the room in soft amber light. The air was warm, filled with the faint scent of the garden outside. Daniel sipped his coffee quietly, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for his presence. "You know," he said, almost as an afterthought, "I didn't realize helping with a stuck window could lead to all this." He gestured vaguely around the room, where boxes were stacked, memories were displayed, and sunlight painted patterns on the floor. I laughed softly. "Neither did I. It's strange how life works. Sometimes the smallest accidents lead to the most unexpected connections." He smiled, and there was something in that smile: understanding, patience, an acknowledgement of the bond forming between us. I felt it too, a warmth that wasn't fleeting but steady, the kind that settles into your chest and makes ordinary moments feel extraordinary. When he left that evening, he lingered at the door, the weight of the day reflected in his gentle expression. "I'll see you soon," he said simply, and I knew we would. Not because of obligation or coincidence, but because a quiet connection had taken root, one built on trust, care, and the shared understanding that life's little accidents sometimes lead to the people who are meant to be there for us. As I closed the door and leaned against it, I realized how much my perspective had changed. What had begun as a moment of vulnerability, the stuck window, had grown into a series of days and experiences that reminded me of the value of presence, kindness, and genuine human connection. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but anticipate what would come next, curious to see how this quiet, unexpected chapter of my life would continue to unfold. By the time the final weeks of summer arrived, the rhythm of our interactions had become a comforting constant. Daniel and I had shared afternoons filled with simple tasks, gardening, organizing, even sitting on the porch quietly with cups of coffee, but each moment seemed to carry a deeper significance. The trust that had started with a laugh over a stuck window had grown into something unspoken yet undeniable, a recognition of each other's presence, a mutual care that required no explanation. One late afternoon, I found myself on the porch, a soft breeze stirring the curtains, watching clouds drift lazily across the sky. Daniel joined me, carrying 2 folding chairs and a thermos of iced tea. We settled into them without fanfare, letting the quiet stretch comfortably between us. I noticed how his eyes followed the clouds, how the corners of his mouth lifted in thought, and I felt a sense of serenity I hadn't realized I was craving. Do you ever think about the small moments that change everything? I asked, almost hesitantly. Daniel nodded slowly. All the time. Life's full of tiny shifts, like unnoticed ripples. Sometimes they only make sense in hindsight. I smiled, appreciating the way he phrased it. It mirrored how I had come to feel about that first incident with the window. Awkward, funny, almost embarrassing, but now, so full of meaning. We talked for hours that day, sharing stories of our pasts, our regrets, our small victories. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years, realizing that there was a quiet joy in being seen and heard without judgment. Daniel listened with a focus that felt rare, asking thoughtful questions, yet giving space when words weren't necessary. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting golden light across the yard, I felt a subtle tension, not uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken understanding. The day had been ordinary in its tasks, yet extraordinary in the connection we had nurtured. There was a beauty in the stillness between words, in the laughter that arose from shared memories, in the glance that conveyed more than sentences ever could. At one point, Daniel reached over to pick up a fallen leaf and handed it to me, and the gesture, so simple, felt like a bridge between our worlds. I realized then that the bond we had formed wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about presence, attentiveness, and the ability to support one another in subtle, meaningful ways. We lingered until the last light faded, the sky deepening into shades of violet and indigo. When he finally stood to leave, there was a moment when neither of us moved, as though we were both savoring the depth of connection that had grown between us. Thank you, I said softly, feeling the weight of the words. For everything. Daniel smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that carried the warmth of understanding. It's been my pleasure. Life's richer with these moments, isn't it? I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into me. Yes, it really is. As he walked back to his house, I remained on the porch for a long time, thinking about how life's unexpected twists, like getting stuck in a window, can lead to profound discoveries. I realized that emotional growth often comes in small, quiet increments: the willingness to accept help, the courage to share memories, the openness to connection. And in that reflection, I understood something important. Life is not just about the moments that seem dramatic or extraordinary, but also about the subtle, tender interactions that shape us quietly from within. That evening, I sat by the window, the same one that had started it all, and watched the night settle over the neighborhood. The stars blinked faintly, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Daniel, but for the reminder that life has a way of gifting unexpected friendships and connections when we least anticipate them. And as I turned in for the night, I carried with me a quiet hope and a newfound understanding that even in life's most ordinary days, we can discover extraordinary moments, and that sometimes, it only takes one gentle presence to illuminate a path we never knew we were seeking. It was a summer I would remember forever, not because of the window or the chores, but because of the quiet bond that grew in its shadow, steady, respectful, and deeply human.